welcome to Games is Lit 101. This is a tough one. I want to talk about current issues in this show. Really the only reason I haven't yet is because the biggest current issue in the world of video games when I started this show was Gamergate, which was a fight that I did not want to toss myself into when it was at its peak. I'll do a retrospective on that sometime when it's long past, but for now, I have found something worth talking about, and it's something of a doozy. I know this was supposed to be a counterpoint episode about games as museums and that whole claim, but when it comes down to it, this is something that's relevant now, and that argument, unfortunately, isn't going anywhere. So, here we are. On, October 16th, 2014, a new small studio called Destructive Creations announced its first game, a game called Hatred. Sorry about the cue cards. I'm really bad at remembering dates, so this is normally the point where I would just put up some trailer footage or gameplay footage so that I could read that information to you guys, but I can't with this one. I just really can't. Though I suppose I can show some lines of dialogue from the beginning of the trailer. Be warned, this dialogue is fairly intense, but I'm not going to show any of the really bad stuff.
My name is not important. What is important is what I'm going to do. I just hate this world and these human worms feasting on its carcass. My whole life is just cold, bitter hatred. And I always wanted to die violently. This is the time of vengeance, and no life is worth saving. And I will put in the grave as many as I can. It's time for me to kill, and it's time for me to die. My genocide crusade begins here.
The rest of the trailer is comprised of our protagonist rampaging around public places, brutally murdering people as they flee and beg for their lives. Which is why I can't actually show any of it in this episode. First, let me say that people have the right to make whatever they want. It's part of free speech, and in no part of this episode am I intending to suggest that hatred should be censored or banned. That said, I do think it's important we consider the implications of actually supporting this game. Firstly, we have to clear up a major distinction here. The violence in Hatred is not the same kind of violence we see in the majority of video games. I have seen games with similarly or even more graphic violence, yes, but there is still one key difference. Intent. There is, after all, a difference between killing and murdering. Video games do often feature a, frankly, rather ridiculous amount of killing, and I do think they need to work on how they justify the large amounts of death that are often involved in the gameplay. As much as I love Uncharted, for instance, I can only kill so many of my fellow human beings before wondering if I'm actually as justified in my actions as I want to be. But that justification is at least there. I'm killing to protect someone, to save people, or defend myself. Hatred is comprised of nothing but mass murder out of pure, arbitrary, well, hatred. You're not killing to protect your nation from invaders, or to save someone, or even to keep yourself from being killed. And the people you're killing are no threat to you or anyone else, or anything else. That context is incredibly important. So we really can't just shrug this off as the same kind of violence that video games usually include. For years, we've defended this medium from people who thought that video games were nothing more than meritless simulators of depraved and violent acts. But this game is exactly the kind of thing they always thought we played. Which brings us to the next issue. Hatred is made specifically as a reaction against the very idea that video games should have any level of meaning. I recognize that sounds a little sensationalist, but the developers themselves have actually made multiple statements that confirm this very plainly. These days, when a lot of games are heading to be polite, colorful, politically correct, and trying to be some kind of higher art, rather than just an entertainment, we wanted to create something against trends. We say, yes, it is a game about killing people, and the only reason of the antagonist doing that sick stuff is his deep-rooted hatred. We wanted to create something contrary to prevailing standards of forcing games to be more polite or nice than they really are or even should be. Our game doesn't pretend to be anything else than what it is, and we don't add to it any fake philosophy. Some other statements include multiple uses of the phrase, "it's just a game," which of course is a notoriously overused way of excusing the medium from any level of importance or responsibility, as well as, interestingly enough, a comparison to the infamous level from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, No Russian, which forces the player to take part in a terrorist attack on an airport. Though I must say, that comparison falls a bit flat to me, considering No Russian was clearly intended to make the player feel incredibly terrible about what was happening. So according to the creators of Hatred, video games shouldn't be trying to be artistic or beneficial, to bring anything positive to the world aside from just time-wasting fun. Video games shouldn't be nice, and trying to add meaning to a video game is just adding fake philosophy. Video games are toys for our entertainment and nothing more. And since video games seem to have lost sight of that lately, Hatred is here to remind us of exactly what video games should look like. This game is being made specifically to speak out against everything video games have accomplished in the last few decades, and making the medium exactly what critics like Jack Thompson always claimed it was. I think it's obvious why I'm not personally a fan. But of course, this spawned plenty of support that basically all came down to the same reasoning. This is different, and it totally flies in the face of all those people trying to bring culture and artistic responsibility and social issues into our video games. And it shouldn't really matter how horrible the content is, it's a game, and it should only be judged based on how fun the gameplay is, and holy crap, I ended up talking about Gamergate anyway. Great. Unsurprisingly, in January of 2015, Hatred became only the third game in the history of the ESRB to attain the Adults Only, or AO, rating specifically for violence. Now, the AO rating is essentially the equivalent to film's NC-17 or X rating. It's usually given to games that are pornographic in nature. Most retailers don't carry them, and they only really exist on PC because the console makers don't actually want them there, like Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft. So if they kept the rating, the game wouldn't actually be carried anywhere, and the creators would be forced to distribute it all on their own. But if they compromised on the content to bring the game down to a more marketable M rating, they would have lost basically the only reason anyone ever actually supported them. So theoretically, this should have been the kiss of death. But surprisingly, the game still has a page on Steam, complete with the AO rating and all its descriptors down in the lower right-hand corner. Now, Steam is the biggest online distributor of computer games, and though they hadn't had a written policy against AO-rated games, they had on multiple occasions refused to add any to the service, and up until now, did not ever carry any AO-rated games. It was assumed that they would uphold that tendency when it came to Hatred, but apparently not. Now, as I said before, the creators of Hatred have absolutely every right to make it. I mean, I think the game is almost as deplorable as the reasons it's being made, but the US Supreme Court rightfully decided a few years back that video games were to be protected as free speech as an art form. So, ironically enough, Hatred is being protected by the very mindset it was made to counteract, but it should still be upheld. That said, Steam, like any retailer, has the right to decide what it does and does not carry. That's not censorship, it's just a perfectly legitimate business practice, and as I said before, we should consider the implications of supporting a game like this and allowing it into the mainstream cultural consciousness of our medium and the culture surrounding it. So, if the implications of supporting a game that actively oppose the artistic value of its medium aren't enough to make us consider this, we need to take a look at something that's been happening on Steam recently. Steam has recently been getting a surprising influx of Japanese visual novels. Games like Hatoful Boyfriend, Higurashi When They Cry, and Planetarian are being offered on the service now, with many more on the way. And that's awesome, because visual novels are a unique genre of video games, and many tell great stories, and we just don't see them in America very often. That said, many of these visual novels are originally adult in nature, with graphic sexual content that's edited out of the Steam releases. Some people have been decrying Steam's decision to only offer censored versions of these visual novels, but I've always understood. I mean, they never previously offered sexually graphic games, like that Playboy game from a while back, or Singles Flirt Up Your Life, for the same reason most retailers don't. So I see no reason why they should start offering graphic depictions of sex in visual novels at this point. But now, I'm not a fan of gratuitous sex in video games, any more than I'm a fan of gratuitous violence in video games, but Steam is setting a precedent here. If they're going to accept hatred at all of its AO-rated glory, there is no reason why they shouldn't also be accepting the fully uncut and uncensored versions of these erotic visual novels. Consistency is important, and I think Steam is kind of painting themselves into a corner with their acceptance of hatred. Again, we must consider the implications of supporting this game. The creators of Hatred seem to be basing their entire design philosophy around the idea that video games have no larger implications and don't need to mean anything. Interesting that the game itself and its effects on our culture thus far, before it even releases, already prove that premise so wrong. So do you think Hatred is harmless fun, or do you think that it's kind of a problematic addition to this medium and its culture? Whatever you think, feel free to talk about it in the comments. Just please try to be civil. I'd hate for my first Current Issues episode to turn into a comment war. Next week, it's time to return to Counterpoint, as I was supposed to this week, where we're going to talk about the argument that video games aren't art themselves, but more like museums, where they have multiple art forms within them. So, until next week, class dismissed.